So as we hear the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, we need to put into context, of course, what they were living before they started heading home. They, like all the followers of Jesus, were excited, turned on by the energy of Palm Sunday. He's entering into Jerusalem, and they believe that he was going to be indeed the fulfillment of all their hopes and aspirations, that God was finally going to do what God had promised to do and was going to set his people free. And so that energy, that enthusiasm, that sense of elation was part of that experience. And then a couple of days later comes Good Friday, and the leaders of the temple and the Roman authorities conspire together, and they kill Jesus. But not only did they kill Jesus, what also was killed was that enthusiasm, that energy, that hope, that belief that finally things were going to be made well. God was going to get around to doing what God had promised. But it all came to a crashing halt. All their hopes, all their dreams, all their aspirations just came to naught. And so what did they do? They headed home. They gave up. It's all over. All that false promises that he made, all the things that he told us he was going to do, came to nothing. And so they're walking home in the same way that we hear the story in another gospel passage where Peter says, I'm going fishing. Peter went back to what he was before he encountered Jesus. So the people on the road to Emmaus are walking home. And in their walking home, what are they doing? They're telling each other the story. Wasn't it not wonderful what he promised us? Did he not just tell us how everything was going to be right? Did we not have all the hopes and the dreams that things were finally going to be made well? And here we are, stuck again in the same old despair that we were in before. You remember he told us that he was going to overthrow injustice. He was going to bring poverty to an end. He was going to make sure that those who were excluded from community were going to be brought in. And there they went and killed them. So none of that's going to happen. It's awful. But that's what he promised that he was going to do. Then all of a sudden, in the midst of their storytelling, in the midst of their remembering, they have an experience of the stranger that's somehow opening their eyes to understand the scriptures. And we can say, well, that's just a miraculous apparition that comes along and out of the bushes he jumped or whatever. Or we perhaps can say they went deeper. They said, well, the promises that he made were rooted in the scriptures of old. And part of what the scriptures of old said was what, of course, Peter quoted from the scriptures in the first reading, that God would not abandon them. I saw the Lord always before me, said David, for he's at my right hand, I will not be shaken. For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One experience corruption. You have made known to me the ways of life. And so they began to recognize in the promises that had been made that maybe they misunderstood Jesus. Maybe they thought it was going to be something of a miraculous imposition of God's way of life upon people, that there wouldn't be any struggle anymore to make it happen. And so in the midst of their journey, the stranger opens their eyes to understand that what Jesus was about was influenced by the scriptures of old, but it also was influenced by God's promise that death would not conquer. So they began to question those women that said that they heard that Jesus was risen from the dead. Well, maybe they were right. Maybe they track. Maybe what we thought when we left Jerusalem and started heading home, maybe we better rethink that, because they said that he was no longer in the tomb. And they went into the house, and this miraculous, strange person was with them at table, and they broke bread together. The same way that they broke bread with Jesus on Holy Thursday, where he opened their eyes and handed them bread and wine and said, "This is my body and this is my blood." And I think I suggested to us, I think it was here, that if we didn't understand Holy Thursday in the light of Easter Sunday, we would be a bunch of cannibals eating Jesus' flesh and blood. But because of Easter Sunday, we know that it's a spiritual Jesus, that risen Lord, that divine experience that we experience when we break bread and share the cup. And so the disciples on the road, going into the house, breaking bread, sharing the cup, say, "Oh my, I feel his presence, like he is here. He said he would be here. He gave me his body and his blood to eat and drink, and he's becoming a part of who I am." And maybe all this despair that I've been experiencing since Good Friday, maybe it really isn't appropriate. Maybe I should be enthusiastic, because if he's risen, then his life is within me, and I got to get busy and fulfill the promise that God made, that people would be treated with respect and justice, and there wouldn't be hunger, and there wouldn't be war, and there wouldn't be abuse of people. And so, filled with that enthusiasm, feeling the presence of Jesus in their lives, they headed back to Jerusalem. And they were told there, well, Simon had something similar of an experience. He felt the presence of the risen Lord. He felt his energy. He experienced that he was no longer who they thought he was. That is, he's no longer dead. He's alive, and he's with them. And so their hearts were transformed, and they spoke, "Were not our hearts burning when he opened scriptures to us? Were we not transformed by the understanding that he wasn't dead, that he was alive? Did that not just turn us around? Did we not become more and more what God is calling us to be?" And so, walking away from Jerusalem with the despair in their hearts, feeling that it's all over, we got transformed by remembering who Jesus was, by doing what Jesus did, by entering into the story of the scriptures that spoke about how God would raise us from death into life, how Jesus wasn't dead, but indeed alive. And they were turned on, and they went back, and they joined in the mission that ended up becoming the church that we belong to. Point of the story, of course, there is that Jesus made promises, people believed in him, Jesus died, and they experienced that death didn't conquer him. But instead of him coming back, looking like he did, he became unrecognizable on the road. He was no longer that physical person. He was spirit. He gathered at table with them. As soon as they recognized him, he disappeared. Well, that's not what somebody with a body does. That's a spirit. That's energy. That's who Jesus then is. And the message there, of course, is that he broke bread, shared the cup, and his life became part of my life, and I continue now in his mission. And so the road to Emmaus was a road of discovery, and despair was turned into joy, and joy was turned into mission, and here we are today. And that could be the end of our story, the end of my reflection for today. But if that's all it is, it's just a nice remembering of what happened to some people some 2,000 years ago. If that's all that it is, I mean, it's a nice story, and hopefully it's true, and hopefully they really did have a good experience, and hopefully they really were sincere when they got onto the mission bandwagon, and we ended up right here today. Nice story, good memories, And we'll read it again next year because Easter will come again. And we'll say, oh yes, here, I remember that story. We heard it before. The disciples are walking along the road. And they just lost the person that they loved. One that they put their hopes in, one that they put their dreams in, was dead. And in that death, there was a death that happened to them as well. There was an emptiness that they were feeling. There was a pain that was unbearable. The one that they loved had died. You know what that feels like. If you haven't lost your husband or your wife, you've lost your mother or your father or brother or sister, you know what that emptiness is like, that pain, the dreams dashed. I officiated at a wedding yesterday, and I heard the young couple making promises to each other. They were going to do all kinds of wonderful things with each other and for each other. The groom even promised that he'd go golfing 3 times a week. But it was a moment of hope, a moment of dream, a moment of great expectations. And everything was going to be well and rosy and beautiful for years and years to come. We were going to grow old together. We'll be so old that we'll be glad to die because we can't stand being in this body anymore. But we know how it feels to lose a loved one. Or maybe you were in love with somebody. He didn't die or she didn't die, but walked away. And all the hopes and dreams that you had in that relationship faded. That emptiness deep inside, that terrible, terrible pain. Well, that's what the people on the road to Emmaus were feeling. But it's not just them. It's us as well. We've all been to that movie. And maybe we're still living it. Maybe we're still feeling the loss of a loved one. Or maybe when we take the time to think about our parents, or think about our lovers, or think about our brothers and sisters or our friends, and we feel what we once felt, how sad it makes us that what we thought was going to be isn't. That's what the road to Emmaus was about for those people there, but it's also about you and me. It's what we feel. And they didn't deny that they were feeling it. Perhaps we need to learn from them that we shouldn't deny that we feel it too. There's an emptiness deep inside, and it just won't let us go if we're honest. And as they were walking along, the stranger comes and he starts sharing stories with them. Stories that began to open their eyes and to feel that the presence of Jesus was with them. He told the stories of what Jesus had promised, what God had promised, told the stories of what Jesus did. And they began to feel that he was there with them. Stories are an important part of the journey. When we lose someone, we don't lose the memories. We don't lose the stories. When we don't tell the stories, and we don't allow ourselves to feel the memories, that we don't feel the presence of the loved one. He's dead, or she's dead, or they went away, they're no longer here, and we close ourselves off and we live in denial. But when we take the risk of sitting with someone and saying, let me tell you the story of my husband, let me tell you the story of my wife, let me tell you the story of my lover, my brother, my sister, whatever. Let me tell you what he was about. It's in that we begin to say, oh God, I'm beginning to feel that, his energy might still be here with me. And then they found themselves at table. And at table, they did something familiar. They broke bread, and they drank from a common cup. And they said, "Gee, we used to do that, you know. Every Sunday night we'd gather as a family, and we'd sit around the table. Hey, don't you do that? Didn't you do that? Tonight I'm going to do a roast beef, and I'm going to cook it the same way my mother cooked it." And in that experience, you say, well, wow, you know, I can feel her presence. And this afternoon I'm going to watch the Blue Jays, and I'll feel my Father's presence. What the road to Emmaus is about is challenging us to feel the emptiness deep inside and to do what the disciples did. Tell the story. Tell the story of our loved ones. Never mind the story of Jesus. That's another experience. But the story of our loved ones that we long to be with once more. And in telling the story, to discover that the promise that's made in Scripture, that death cannot conquer us, leads us to the conclusion, I hope, through all of that storytelling and doing the familiar, that there is no such thing as death. There is a transformation from the physical into the spiritual. But just like they experienced on the road to Emmaus the spiritual presence of Jesus, we too can experience and feel the presence of the spiritual reality of our loved ones still with us. But to do it, we need to tell stories. We need to allow ourselves to remember. We need to do the familiar. And we need to discover in all of that jeepers, the one that I thought was dead isn't dead at all. As St. John would tell us in his writings, the one I thought was dead has become just like God. That's what we say about Jesus, don't we? But it's not just true of Jesus. It's true of all our loved ones. And the sad part about it is that we don't claim that faith. We don't claim that reality. We bury our dead and we think, well, they're in the cemetery. Well, they're not. We don't bury people. We don't cremate people. They no longer are in a body, so we don't need the body anymore. It doesn't mean they're dead. It means they become spirit, like Jesus became spirit. And they're here with us. Our challenge is to believe that, and to be inspired by it, and to continue to do what they love to do. What's good, of course, not what's bad. But what's good, of course. Forgive the bad, but claim the good, and keep the good going. Keep the enthusiasm going. I oftentimes, when I read the story of the road to Emmaus, I think of Dan Hill's song, Sometimes When We Touch. I think of the disciples, you know, who had the experience of being with Jesus and feeling that in that experience of encounter, as Hill would say, I want to hold you till I die, till we both break down and cry. I want to hold you till the fear in me subsides. Sometimes when we touch. Well, that's what we need to be experiencing with our loved ones. Use the Jesus story, use the road to Emmaus story, and apply it to ourselves. And admit that the emptiness that they were feeling is the emptiness that we feel. And the discovery that they discovered is a discovery that we can continue to discover. And we can be touched by our loved ones who are now spirit. And we want to hold them till we die. Not die, but when our bodies die and we become like them. I want to hold you till I cry. I want to hold you till the fear in me subsides. You know, one of the great fears that people have, and it's a fear that paralyzes, is the fear of death. We don't want to admit it. We don't want to talk about it. We certainly don't want to embrace it. It's a scary thought. But the road to Emmaus is telling us that the disciples discovered that there is no such thing as death. They thought he was dead, but he was with them all along. We think our loved ones are dead, but they are with us all along in a different way, perhaps even in a greater way because they have become like God. And we find them when we admit the emptiness deep inside. And when we do the familiar, and we tell the story, and we allow ourselves to believe. Now we're here today because, for whatever good reason, we believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. We believe that 3 days after he died, he came back into the experience of the disciples. We read it as if he was stuck in a grave for 3 days and then broke out of it. That's not the story. The story is that it took the disciples 3 days to get back to the tomb where they thought he was, and he wasn't. Never was there to begin with. His body was. They learned not to be afraid of death when they discovered that he wasn't dead. So too with us. We go to urns, we go to caskets. We think our loved ones are there. They're not. They're with us in the same way that the road to Emmaus disciples discovered the one they thought was dead is alive. And they get back into Jerusalem, they tell their story, and they hear Simon Peter said, he's not in the tomb. He never was. He died and rose again because the Father has dominion over death, and death doesn't conquer, and there is no such thing as death. So friends, I guess the bottom line is we read the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and as best we can, we need to identify with them. They were upset and depressed because they lost their lover. They lost Jesus. We identify with them. We need to then allow ourselves to say, yes, that's me too. I've lost. There's an emptiness. And they discovered that emptiness was taken away because they told the story and they did the familiar. Tell stories. Do the familiar. Allow your loved one to be who your loved one has become. Allow that experience to be your experience as well as theirs. Were not our hearts burning when he opened our eyes? Will not our hearts burn even more when we discover that the ones we thought were dead are very much alive and with us? And we discover them as the Emmaus Road disciples discovered Jesus, because death cannot conquer, not just Jesus, but all our loved ones and us as well. And so we should not fear death. We should embrace life and live it to the full, and embrace our loved ones who, just like God, are with us on the journey. Now, of course, those who are with us on the journey are not visible to us. We don't see them. Right? We have to have faith that they are there. Well, we also have to have faith when we sing hymn number 225, because we praise you for the sun. And God knows we haven't seen the sun in the
We keep hoping.
225.